Codifying testosterone-based science as the true indicator of who is eligible to be considered a girl or a woman sets a precedent in which womanhood continues to get policed. Hello to the world, welcome to another episode of Dwell On It, a series where I, Taylor, answer your questions about my lived experience as a trans woman. If you'd like to have questions of your own included in a future episode, please don't hesitate to include them in the comments, or you can send them to me by DM, and I'll make sure to include them in a grab bag to be drawn out randomly in a future episode. If you're new here, please make sure to subscribe. Content gets uploaded at least once a week with a new episode, or if there are other projects for everyone else who follows the channel regularly. And if you haven't subscribed yet, make sure to please do as well. For both, turn the notification icon with that little bell thing if that's up your alley. If you enjoyed today's content and any other episode that you've watched, please make sure to hit like. Liking helps give things a little bit of a nudge when it comes to algorithms and whatnot. So if there are other individuals who are interested in similar content, when videos like mine and other videos that I've uploaded get liked, they end up being promoted in those homepages or recommended videos for those users too. So hitting like does a huge favor of helping share the message. And on the topic of sharing, please share, especially today's episode. This is going to be a very curated episode based on stuff that's been happening lately. When you share, what that does is it helps expand the reach. I say this all the time and it sounds almost like a silly catchphrase at this point, but my reach is only as far as I can reach. By sharing, what you're doing is you're helping broaden the message to individuals and platforms that I don't currently have access to. So you do a huge favor for this type of conversation, for this type of advocacy, by hitting the share button or putting it onto your social feeds or whatnot as well. If you've been following along for a while, you might notice I'm shifted just a little bit, and it's not because of a new office layout. It's because this episode, as I mentioned, is going to be specifically curated. It feels like I've got about 500 tabs open on my computer right now, so what I likely will be caught doing a few times during this episode is reading the screen instead of talking a little more organically. This is, as I mentioned, a curated episode. When it comes to those links, there are going to be many times, of course, just like most other videos, that if there is something that I'm going to reference, I'm going to point over here, so make sure to take a look at those when they show up. But also in the description as well are going to be these links to offer either citations or resources for information that I provide. Another factor that may or may not make a difference during this episode is my air conditioner. It is a little muggy right now. Of course, I'm going to do the best that I can to edit it out. The least that I ask from everybody watching this right now is to have a little bit of mindfulness should the air conditioner end up getting in the way. I don't think it's going to be too much of a problem, but I just want to give a small heads up in case there is a little bit of excessive background noise during all of this. My priority is the storytelling about this, not about pristine background audio or anything like that. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a heads up in case that did come across as a distraction to some individuals. And that said, since I've been talking about my living room quite a bit at this point, let's do a visual description really quickly before we get into things here. I'm in my living room right now. It is a little darker for two reasons. One, I kind of changed focus of the camera this time, and also it is a little later at night. It's 9:30 right now. Otherwise, it's the same old living room, beige walls. If there's a little perspective, I've got a lamp behind me. I've got a very much a hand-me-down couch that I've had for many a year. Over to my side as well are parts of my gym, as I mentioned regularly. I've got my recumbent bicycle, I've got my treadmill, and I have my elliptical. Yes, this was a jump cut because I noticed my hair was starting to get a little wild already, but nonetheless, let's talk about me. I've got long, wavy blonde hair that's a little past my armpits at this point. It's swept over the left side of my face, and I've got my 3 piercings, as always, on the right side of my face, underneath my right eye, and small, medium, large, going outwards towards a cluster earring on my right ear. I've got 2 stud piercings. We can only see one right now, obviously. I've got a nose piercing as well. The color palette for my makeup is based on green/brown. I am wearing an orange t-shirt, and on top of that is a gray and black horizontally striped hoodie. Yes, it is summer. I am wearing a hoodie for a few reasons, and one of them, my air conditioner, when it's on, it is on. Speaking of, it turned on right now, so this is just a good testament about this may or may not be background noise later. This is a bit of a jump cut. I completely overlooked a land acknowledgement while I was trying to get an introduction started, and with that, first, I apologize, and second, I acknowledge I live and work on Treaty 1 territory, which are ancestral lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I acknowledge that my water gets sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. I respect the treaties that were made on these territories. I acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past and dedicate myself to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Not only do I want to discuss the wave of trans exclusion policies, and yes, I said exclusion, don't call them inclusion policies, because they are not. So these trans exclusion policies that have constantly been coming up, and especially the two most notable ones in the last week at the time of this recording, of course, being FINA and with rugby, not only do I want to discuss that, but I also want to talk about how it all came to where we are today. I don't want to be another voice condemning, FINA's anti-trans policy. I don't want to be another voice saying that FINA or International Rugby League or International Cycling Union, for that matter, are helping propagate trans erasure and then just leave. I'm going to talk about things like trans erasure because I don't hear that often enough, but if I just said something as basic as I condemn this, I'm going to sound like every other individual who condemns this. And I feel it is very important, and again, this is one of the reasons why I really want as many people as possible to share this message, and I don't want to explain why, as in why I condemn it. I want to explain why, as in why this is condemnable, and more importantly, why you have a responsibility to condemn this as well. Please share this. This is going to be longer. I have no idea how long this is going to get. All I know is that this is something critical to discuss. This is something critical to get educated about. This is critical to inform others about, and this is critical to stop accepting if you don't feel that you are harmed in any way by it. If you feel that you are not affected by this, you are the people who need the most. Before I get into anything else, it would be absolutely ignorant if I do not address the Supreme Court in the United States overturning Roe v. Wade. I don't think there's anything that I can say that is something that has not yet been heard. I can't express how frustrated I am at government officials and people of power taking any sort of bodily autonomy away from individuals. Every individual has a right to their bodily autonomy, and for that to be taken away by people who have zero comprehension of humanity is distressing, to say the least. There's no surprise that I've discussed repeatedly, whether it was in videos or in just personal conversations with individuals or angry emails to platforms for miscellaneous reason here. It feels like the world is falling backwards at an exponential rate, and as much as in many places, especially in the Western world, the public as a whole represents a rather progressive stance on fill in the blank. The decision makers, the lawmakers, the elected officials, the people who don't care what you think are turning this planet into one of the most horrific versions of a world that I never would have imagined experiencing. When I was growing up, I was terrified of coming out for all the reasons that are related to coming out. Never on my worst thought would I have considered the world being in the condition that it is as it is right now. I'm grateful that as an adult and obviously a much more conscious individual than I was when I was younger, I can see the direction of the world as it is going right now. Part of the reason why this is a very important video that I really hope that everyone takes time to share is because as much as people want to say that the world is becoming a better place, unless you are one of those individuals who do not get harmed by any legislation, this world is horrific. And I can only imagine how not just women, but anybody who is able to get pregnant, which includes, remember, non-binary individuals, trans men, and every other gender identity I didn't mention, they all are affected by this harm. And it is the responsibility of everybody, including those individuals who have no comprehension of what harm is like, to amplify that message to stop this harm. We are not in a safe place anymore. And I have no idea when we're going to be in a safe place again. And I'd like to remind everyone who's familiar with my content, part of the reason why this is going to have a very different flow compared to what we might be used to from typical episodes of Dwell On It and so on, is because I feel it is critical and imperative for me to provide sources, citations, and so on, as I mentioned. As much as I want to speak organically, I also want to stay in line with material that I'm referencing, because if I'm really strongly asserting individuals to take a look at these links, I want to make sure that they know what they're looking for and not trying to unparaphrase what I paraphrase. Thank you in advance for your patience, because this one's tough. This is going to be a tough one. There are other videos that I've done that are very difficult. I will be sharing them later. I know that already, but this one hits home. As you make it to the end, you'll understand why. I had somewhat of a script ready to go, and then something showed up in my inbox earlier today, which I'm going to add to things. So very likely a lot of material in this part right here is going to get repeated as we go on. The benefit of that is this is going to be a nice little sampler to help everyone understand better some of the things that are going to be getting discussed. This is long, this is informative, this is going to have bookmarks, this is worth reading, this is worth watching, this is worth watching again, and this is worth making sure to come back to if you can't sit down and watch the entire thing all at once. So as I mentioned, something plopped in my inbox, which of course is very worth sharing. It's trans inclusion is inclusion. Inclusion Incorporated response to gender exclusion policies. I like how they use gender exclusion too. This isn't an inclusion policy by any stretch. These are measures to remove individuals, to halt individuals from participating, to make it essentially impossible for people to participate as their best selves at the best levels. Over the past week, we have seen 2 international sports federations come out with gender inclusion policies, quotes deliberate, and included. FINA, the international body for aquatic sports, put their policy forward to their members on Sunday, and it was adopted. The policy will only allow transgender women who began transitioning before the age of 12 to compete in high-level international competitions. International Rugby League went even further, banning all transgender women from international matches. These new policies came after the International Olympic Committee announced last year that it would not set a blanket rule for all sports, which is something that I criticized rather heavily, and I'll explain in a bit. IOC told federations they should come up with their own policies, so until this point, most of these organizations, including FINA and World Athletics, they've allowed trans and intersex women to compete as long as they met the rules for suppressing testosterone levels. These new policies aren't coincidentally timed, and I want people to really grasp that. This goes to everything I was saying a few moments ago when it came to the US Supreme Court taking away bodily autonomy and so on. This is a systemic issue. These aren't just conveniently timed, oh, we needed to get this done by the end of June because it's the June thing we have to do. Happy Pride, everyone, by the way. So these policies, they're harmful, obviously. They're very transphobic, and they're guided by fear. And I'm really happy that this article mentioned that. They're not guided by science. They're guided by fear. And they're not guided by hate, because hate stems from fear. So there's some data in here that I'm going to get into more details about. It's important to bring these up while I'm staring at them right now. And there's no research, evidence, or consistent examples of trans athletes dominating women's sports. That's the key thing. What is happening is the typical fear-mongering of turning the idea of an advantage into an obliteration. Because of that, the word dominating and so on are getting grabbed onto and used as a mechanism to tell every individual who once thought they had hope that they are now hopeless. And that is harmful. There is evidence that a woman's body drastically changes when they start taking hormones to align with their gender. I will acknowledge, as you go through a testosterone-based puberty, your body does develop differently than an estrogen-based body. I'm not going to ignore that, because it's not something we can ignore. But again, the fear-mongering of this concept, I may as well use this transparently as an example. At my heaviest a few years ago, I think I used a wrong number at some point in the past, but I was still floating around the same idea. The more that I think about it, I was about 218 pounds at my heaviest, and I think that was around 2017, 2018. And it was around 2017, 2018 when I started to recognize that I have no choice but to embrace my identity. I can't try to hide in a life that's inauthentic. So nonetheless, while we're here, while I hopped on the scale this morning, I'm 153 pounds. Still just as tall as I was, but still 6'1", 153 pounds. That aside from anything else, I want people to embrace how much a body can change, just like anyone else. Just like for anyone else who chooses to live their best life. Compared with cisgender, heterosexual adolescents, trans adolescents showed 5 times the risk of suicidal ideation and 7.6 times the risk of suicide attempt. 64% of participants reported that they had seriously considered suicide in the previous 12 months. Transgender and gender non-conforming youth seem to have a higher probability of many risk factors for suicidality, including peer victimization, family dysfunction, and barriers to accessing mental health care. For the bigots who are still watching this right now, what those big words mean is that trans youth kill themselves because they're not accepted by their friends, family, and, on topic, sports agencies. Regarding violence, 1 in 4 trans women who were victimized during an episode of violence thought the incident was a hate crime, compared to 1 in 10 cisgender women. What I like about this article as well is it is going to follow a pattern that is something that I'm going to try to not necessarily emulate, but I'm conscious about. I live in Canada. We acknowledge that I live in Canada. When you look at the genetic makeup of an individual, that's not localized to a region of the world. Intersex individuals in the US, for example, is reported around 1 in every 100 people. But because it is a biological thing, we can confidently expect about 1 in every 100 people in Canada are intersex as well. Stuff like that, which is why I'm okay with using some statistics based on region. Obviously, there's some mindfulness about locations in each region, but I think we can look past that and kind of see what's happening as a broad scope overall. At the fact that policies in the US and generally the influence of the United States, let alone other Western countries too, have such an influence on their peers and their neighbors as well, even though the politics don't necessarily cross borders, a lot of people forget that they don't, and they have behaviors and beliefs from other locations in the world expecting the same thing to happen in their own backyard. There are approximately 15 million high school students in the US, and approximately 8 million of them participate in high school sports. I want to point something out really quickly right there. When it comes to participating in sports at youth, 50%, sometimes 75%, depending on the surveys, is a number that is not uncommon. When it comes to adults, 20 to 25% of adults stay athletic going forward. That's just a stat that I want people to think of as well when they consider how prominent individuals are as they go through their life and how important sport or athletics are to them. A CDC study published in 2019 estimated that 1.8% of high school students are transgender, meaning there are roughly 270,000 transgender students in U.S. high schools. 1.8% is a higher number than what you would find for a census in Canada, for example. In Canada, the 2021 census for ages 15 and up in Canada, 0.33% of Canadians are trans. In the US, off the top of my head, across the board, it was about 0.6. So what 1.8 is suggesting and identifying is that more youth are recognizing and accepting their gender identity at a younger age than other demographics that are older than them. So as I mentioned earlier, about 50% of students play sports. Human Rights Campaign found that only 14% of trans boys and 12% of trans girls play sports. That's not close to 50% at all. That's not even close to 20 or 25%. Why would that possibly be? It's statistically possible that there's about 35,000 trans student athletes in high school, which means about 0.44% of high school athletes are trans. I'm going to discuss bills and whatnot later, but I want to point out, in case anyone missed it, Kentucky, for example, passed a statewide anti-trans bill, and they have 1 student athlete who is trans. Part of the reason why I embraced this article is because it is closing with something that I am going to be addressing repeatedly. Sports should not be perpetuating this violence. Nobody needs it. These types of policies are rooted in protectionism, and they're protecting a sport world that doesn't actually exist. Each athlete has advantages and disadvantages based on their genetics, their circumstances, their experiences, and their access. There are so many more parts of being a human being than showing up at a playing field. These policies are made and created through the lens of someone who has their perfect sports world in their head, without understanding what the lived experience is of any other individual. In recent history, of course, all started when the IOC released a framework that's supposed to save the day when it comes to trans inclusion in their sports. And so the IOC framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination on the basis of gender identity and sex variations. If you want to piss me off with a 4-letter F word, it's fair. I'm going to get into fairness in a little bit, but I'd like to get to some talking points about the biology before we start talking about the fairness. Before we get into anything else though, as I mentioned, I criticized this framework for one major reason, and that's because it was not a mandate. If it was a mandate, that means that every single governing body has to follow at least the guiding principles of the framework. Instead, the IOC put the responsibility on all of the organizations, the governing bodies that are underneath the IOC, the subsidiaries and so on, and suggested to them what would be ideal to be as inclusive as possible for trans athletes, but essentially said, we find it really complicated and we don't want to deal with the backlash, and we really don't want to deal with the arguments and the pushback from stakeholders and financial investors and from all the countries in the world who enforce state-sponsored violence. We don't want to tell them to be nice to people that they don't want to be nice to. Therefore, we're going to just ask everybody to do the right thing and close our eyes and say we tried our best. That's what actually happened. And instead, since the IOC pretty much said, hey, it's a free-for-all based on your own location, based on your own jurisdiction, it now let organizations decide what makes a woman, define fairness based on their own ethic, define ethic based on their lobbyists, and so on. So I criticized that, saying it was harmful. All it was going to do is create problems, create harm, not create an ideal, and absolutely not create a solution. If the IOC mandated what trans inclusion looks like, for example, overnight, an organization like FIFA would have to mandate trans inclusion. And Qatar, if they want to host something like FIFA, would have to adapt their policies, their worldview, to be more accepting and inclusive. And should they choose not to, then an organization like FIFA would have to use a different location because this organization is not supportive of all the athletes who we feel have a belonging in sport. Those are the types of results that happen when you mandate inclusion. Organizations have to follow suit. It's not authoritarian, not by any stretch. If you don't want to be an inclusive organization, don't be an inclusive organization. You just can't participate with us because we only want to participate with inclusive organizations. It's not a difficult system. What's difficult is people having the courage and bravery to support that type of practice, to support that type of responsibility, where eligibility criteria must be set in order to regulate the participation in the women's and men's categories. The establishment and implementation of such criteria should be carried out as part of a comprehensive approach grounded on respect for internationally recognized human rights, robust evidence, and athlete consultation. In so doing, precautions should be taken to avoid causing harm to the health and well-being of athletes. While the framework has been drafted with the specific needs of high-level organized sports competitions in mind, the general principles of inclusion and non-discrimination should be promoted and defended at all levels of sport, especially for recreational and grassroots sport. The IOC is not the one-stop shop, of course, for sports in the world. However, there is no question that the IOC is quite likely the most influential governing body on this planet. And the language in all of what I just said hinges on one word, should. The word should is a word of frustration. It's a word of judgment. You should do this. As in, what you're currently doing is not projected to be something that pleases me. Or, what you're currently doing is not benefiting you. Framing the language as in, it is in the best interest and responsibility of the IOC's membership to ... It is commanding change. And then on top of that, instead of guidelines, if it was mandates, and simply saying, here's how we want trans individuals to be included in our organized sports. That way, a trans child who wants to play U8 soccer is going to be able to succeed at high-level, elite athlete-level sport when they prove their success, to make sure that they can go through a system that is consistent, welcoming, with belonging and inclusion, not to go through stages of systems that may or may not accept those individuals along the way and then possibly just get halted because, yeah, well, we don't treat you for who you are. Go kick the ball somewhere else. To roll back some of the history of trans inclusion in sports, it would be important for us to look around. Let's start in the 60s, give or take. In 1968 is when very crude attempts at gender verification were being done. Typically, it'd be with, I believe the word's pronounced buccal, B-U-C-C-A-L, but anyway, it's a cheek swab. And they'd be using that to try to identify the chromosomal sex of participants. And of course, it would only be for the women who would be subject to these tests. And all of this in an effort to prevent imposters was essentially what the declarations were about, to prevent imposters from dominating sports. One of the biggest challenges when it comes to chromosomal sex testing was the fact that it's actually not as reliable as people were trying to make it out to be, particularly for the concept of it's as simple as XX and XY. It can't be any more difficult than that, except it's significantly more complicated than that. The human body is rather dynamic and sometimes pretty funky beast. So to borrow a quote from this one article, until the last decade, this remained the standard for gender verification, notwithstanding that by the mid-1970s, the test was discarded by medical professionals as technically unreliable. More importantly, the test detected athletes who were unassailably feminine, undeniably is the more appropriate word. You look at me like, oh, okay, yeah, no, feminine, but who happened to have an XY chromosomal pattern. Many of these individuals had variants of androgen resistance. And just for context, to simplify things, androgen, testosterone, treat those as the same word. It's not the same word, but let's just keep it as the same word. The context is identical for what we're talking about here. Either complete or partial, in which case they are naturally resistant to the strength-promoting qualities of testosterone. So now knowing that, let's talk sex. Biological sex, biological sex, biological sex. Language that bigots and transphobes and TERFs and anyone else who's got a brain that's smoother than a swimmer's body loves preaching about biological sex. If we want to talk about biological sex, we must first stop talking with the words biological sex, because there's more to that. There's genotypic sex, which is the chromosomes that we're talking about, and there's the phenotypic sex, and that is what the body looks like. Both of those are biological processes, so which one are we talking about now? Because you've got an individual with XY chromosomes looking like an XX body, and if we do want to take things just a little bit further, but I'm not going to get too deep into it because it's not going to change the topic, gender identity is also a biological process. Gender identity, the sense of self, happens in the brain in conjunction with the world around the individual and the body that they've been gifted from the moment they were born. Biological sex embodies all of the things that bigots choose to ignore, but that's status quo anyway. So to recap, genotypic sex refers specifically to an individual's two sex chromosomes. Most people have either two X chromosomes, genotypic female, or an X and Y chromosome, genotypic male. Phenotypic sex refers to an individual's sex as determined by their internal and external genitalia, expression of secondary sex characteristics, and behavior. So when a doctor does the whole sex assigned at birth thing, most likely are basing it on phenotypic sex. Oh, that's a penis. So if everything proceeds according to plan during development, the XX genotype leads to a person with ovaries, oviducts, uterus, cervix, clitoris, labia, vagina, and what we would be defined as a phenotypic female. And by the same token, the XY genotype leads to a person with testicles. I'm laughing because there's actually some large words that I don't think I've ever actually pronounced before. Testicles I pronounced before. Epididymis? I'm gonna have to look these up. Vas deferens, seminal vesicles, penis, and stroke. See, the thing that's funny, I'm just gonna say this right, like, fully transparently. I don't talk about bits and pieces, ever. But nonetheless, all of those join the party, and that would be a phenotypic male. And those are objective. Those are things that can be measured, whether it's by chromosomal testing or looking. Those are objective. Gender refers more broadly to an individual's subjective perception of their sex and their sexual orientation. It is therefore harder to define than genotypic or phenotypic sex. I always like to point out, I do hope I am pronouncing that properly. No one's corrected me ever on that yet, so run with it. Generally speaking, either way, gender identity entails self-appraisal according to the traits most often associated with one sex or the other, called gender traits. These can be influenced to some degree by cultural norms. I do want to point out this article was written in 2001, so we also want to acknowledge that, aside from the two genders that are being implied in here, we want to acknowledge as well, as mentioned numerous times otherwise, whether it's two-spirit, non-binary, and other gender-diverse individuals too. Nonetheless, sexual orientation also entails self-appraisal in the context of culture. For the purposes of understanding the neurobiology of sex, it is helpful to think of genotypic sex as largely immutable, phenotypic sex is modifiable, that would be by developmental processes, hormone treatment, and or surgery, and gender as a more complex construct that is determined culturally as well as biologically. So of course, XX and XY are not the only combinations of genetic variations. Clearly then, genotypic sex, phenotypic sex, and gender are not always aligned. Variations in alignment can be minor, or they can challenge the usual definitions of male and female and lead to psychosocial conflicts, sometimes sexual dysfunction. Genetic variations include individuals who are XO, Turner syndrome, XXY, Klinefelter syndrome, or XYY. Each of these genotypes has its own phenotype. Other genetic variations arise from mutations in genes coding for hormone receptors or for the hormones themselves. For instance, metabolic disorder that leads to overactive adrenals during maturation, called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, causes abnormally high levels of circulating androgens and hence, along with severe salt imbalance, an ambiguous sexual phenotype. Transgender and gender diverse individuals have existed for millennia. And the last that I would like to point out in here, an example of a mutation in a gene responsible for hormone receptors is androgen insensitivity syndrome. I believe in the last article it called it androgen resistance. Nonetheless, androgen insensitivity syndrome, AIS, also called testicular feminization. The receptor deficiency leads to the development of the internal genitalia of a male, which are probably all the things I can't pronounce, and the external genitalia of a female, which I can easily pronounce, in an individual who's genotypically XY. So, bigots, what's XY again? Thus, people with androgen insensitivity syndrome look like women and self-identify as women, even though they have a Y chromosome. And since they're generally not aware of their condition until puberty, when they fail to menstruate, they see themselves and are experienced by others as women. Thus, their gender identity matches external sexual phenotype, but not genotype. This is relatively uncommon. It's about 1 in every 4,000 individuals at the time of this publishing. What I'm getting to is what's the magic in the I of the 2S LGBTQIA+ acronym I, intersex. 1, maybe up to 2% of our population around us are intersex individuals. You watching this right now could be intersex and have no clue. And you would have never had a reason to try to find out if you're intersex or not. And to everyone who wants to trust the science, let's all start by learning some science. Codifying testosterone-based science as the true indicator of who is eligible to be considered a girl or a woman sets a precedent in which womanhood continues to get policed. All of these policies, they're based in fear and they're based in control. They're not about the well-being of others, but this is control. This is about defining who is a woman, and by creating definitions that are arbitrary and beneficial only to the decision makers, every woman allows themselves to get policed. Whether or not a woman is directly affected by the definition of having testosterone or not, by being put into consideration, you are allowing people to police you. You are allowing people who have no right to define your body to define your body. There's so much tunnel vision focused on defining whether or not trans women are eligible in sports, what makes a trans woman a woman, so on, without recognizing the conversation happening at the exact same time are decision makers qualifying if you are a woman. And that is where these failures must get addressed and halted immediately. This is a piece written by Shireen Ahmed. It might be Shireen. I hope that either of those two were pronounced properly. Women's Bodies Policed. Of course, the article is regarding FINA. I'm a hijab-wearing woman, and women like me were banned from playing soccer and basketball at a professional level due to policies created largely by powerful men in boardrooms. They were usually ill-advised by women who campaigned that women in headscarves were all oppressed. They decided that hijab was dangerous and did not belong on the pitch or court. We know this is not true. They never consulted my community or people like me. And for years, women's bodies were policed and they were excluded from sports. It will take generations to engage them in elite sports at those levels. When you remove an entire group of individuals, they don't just magically float themselves back into the group that they were punted out of. They need to reestablish themselves in that group. Not from them trying to find their way back in, but from the group that kicked them out to organically reintroduce those same individuals that they were exclusionary towards. It will take generations for that to happen because you need to have generations of change. So this article came out in 2020. Still just as valid and accurate as it was then as it is now, and likely will be for quite a while, unless people actually, do weird and funky things like share the message and help instigate change. The article itself is called 4 Myths About Trans Athletes Debunked. I'm not going to overinvest my time in here because I'm going to discuss things otherwise, but absolutely this is a link I recommend you check out. Fact, including trans athletes will benefit everyone. The myth is the participation of trans athletes hurts cis women. Many who oppose the inclusion of trans athletes erroneously claim that allowing trans athletes to compete will harm cisgender women. This divide and conquer tactic gets it exactly wrong. Excluding women who are trans hurts all women. It invites gender policing that could subject any woman to invasive tests or accusations of being too masculine or too good at their sport to be a real woman. In Idaho, the ACLU represents 2 young women, one transgender, one cisgender, both of whom are hurt by the law that was passed targeting trans athletes. The Ohio House of Representatives passed a bill that apparently is getting modified, but wait till you see it, but it is including genital exams on any student athlete who is disputed to be participating in a division that is not in alignment with their sex assigned at birth. Any student athlete who is disputed to not belong. And what that means is that first, the probability of experiencing a trans athlete is slim to nil in the first place. Second, that is a tactic that is going to be used, whether it's by hate or by ignorance, by individuals who feel they can violate another individual for their own benefit. Whether they're too masculine, too good, or so on. So who could possibly get affected? You could probably start with people of color. Any racist would have no problem applying this policy on an individual who's a person of color, as it was alluded to, too masculine. I'm going to say this in a very mindful way. I hope this is just something that can create possibly an image in people's minds, but a modern day Peppermint Patty. I want to acknowledge that I'm grateful that Peppermint Patty got the roasting that was due for some pretty racist remarks during I think it was Charlie Brown Thanksgiving, I think it was. I remember I was rewatching that not terribly long ago, and wow, can't say that. Anyway, we're talking about the look. So again, Peppermint Patty excels at insert sport because Peppermint Patty excels at sport, and somebody doesn't like that. And so Peppermint Patty has to go ahead and get a Genel inspection just because of a dispute. Lawmakers feel that that's appropriate for fairness and safety, for dignity. As I mentioned a little while ago, this is all about protectionism. So the myth here, it's reinforcing a stereotype that women are weak and in need of protection. And politicians continue to use this protection trope time and time again, reminding women that they are weak and inferior. The motive isn't about protection. It is about excluding, if not erasing, trans individuals from yet another public space. That said, including trans athletes promotes values of inclusion and non-discrimination amongst all student athletes, let alone the communities that they're part of. So banning girls from athletics because they are transgender undermines the cohesion of what sport is to be about, inclusive and caring environments, and it compromises the benefits that youth and all participants from sports experience. And as we were talking about genotypic sex, phenotypic sex, and the policing of women's bodies, let's now ask ourselves, why do we allow some of these things for some individuals, yet amplify discrimination for others? We celebrated MichaelPhelps' genetic differences, so why punish Caster Semenya for hers? Michael Phelps, pterodactyl arms, flipper feet, name it, the perfect swimmer. Caster, however, also an incredibly successful individual, constantly scrutinized and questioned about not only her identity, but her worth. So to quote the beginning of this article, I've been reading about the unique genetic blessings bestowed upon the greatest swimmer to ever live. Michael Phelps possesses a disproportionately vast wingspan. He's 6'4", and his pterodactyl arms reach to 6'7". His double-jointed ankles give his kick an unusual range. With size 14 feet, those are pretty big flippers anyway. And in a quirk that borders on supernatural, Michael Phelps apparently produces about half the lactic acid that's typical for an athlete. And since lactic acid causes fatigue, he's simply better equipped at a biological level to excel in his sport. For anyone who might not know what lactic acid does in terms of performance, for anyone who has, whether they've run for a period of time or they've been on a treadmill for an excessive amount of time or anything like that, and that burn that you feel in your legs, that part where your body's like, I just can't do it anymore, that exhaustion, that is partially related to lactic acid, that buildup. When that pain is happening, or the tiredness, or the sluggishness, or the burn, or whatever you want to call it, that is happening because of that lactic acid buildup, no matter how you are feeling about performing, your body is literally saying, I must rest. And so for Michael Phelps to not have to experience that anywhere near as much as most athletes out there is a pretty supernatural thing, all things considered. So I'm thinking of these stories because I'm thinking about the ways that Michael Phelps was treated as a wondrous marvel. Nobody suggested he should be forced to have corrective surgery on his double-jointed ankles, or trim his pterodactyl arms, and nobody decided that he should take medication to boost his lactic levels. I know I question that. If it was such a unique thing, and we always want to talk about fairness, then either every competitor should be provided, which would then go against anti-doping, but you see where I'm going with this, but be provided a solution to be able to process lactic acid the same way as Michael Phelps did, or Michael Phelps would then have to experience lactic acid production the same as everyone else, if we want to talk fairness, right? However, about Caster, powerful runner from South Africa, two-time Olympic champ, subject to controversy left, right, and center because her body allegedly produces testosterone at a higher level than most women. The Court of Arbitration for Sport ruled that if Caster wants to compete, she has to be required to take medications to lower her testosterone production. I want to understand again, why does Michael Phelps, who naturally produces a system that manages his lactic acid at a certain level at a rate that is untouchable to most other athletes ever, he's okay, but Caster has to bring her naturally embedded body's production down. At the time, the IAAF said that Caster's body had to produce a testosterone amount of less than 5 nanomoles per liter. I'm going to save the science, but 5's the number. We seem to buy into this idea that there's precisely two genders, which we've already established. It is not empirically accurate, but there's a firm line saying it's one or the other. Therefore, if Caster had 4.99 nanomoles per liter of testosterone, qualifies as a woman. However, if Caster had 5.01 nanomoles of testosterone per liter, then they no longer would. We could talk about what it means to be a woman, or what it means to insist that someone is not a woman, and why Michael Phelps was treated like a marvel, and Caster Semenya is treated like a mutant. So on the topic of Michael Phelps, since we're here, and his pterodactyl arms, I wanted to point out a couple things that are a little interesting, especially considering he chose to throw his hat in the ring about trans participation in swimming. Michael Phelps had some thoughts, which certainly riled up enough people, including his trans ex-girlfriend. I'm not going to get into the article, but I'd like to share it mainly for the fact his ex had a line that it's actually really eloquently spoken, to be completely honest. And she says, in that moment of watching and hearing him say those things, it felt like a literal slap in the face. Quote, like I was not a woman, but rather an alien or God knows what. End quote. It can't be a women's sport if it does not include all women. full stop. So now that we've established some of the biology, and now we can park that over to the side and start discussing a different chapter and start talking about policy. In 2020, World Rugby released new guidelines that barred transgender women from playing rugby internationally because of player welfare risks. I want to make it clear right now that over the course of this video, I'm going to mention World Rugby, and I'm going to also mention International Rugby League. They're not the same thing. World Rugby and International Rugby League are two different types of rugby. There's rugby league and rugby union. For a passive observer, the sport is pretty similar. Nonetheless, World Rugby is what I'm talking about right now. International Rugby League is what I'm going to talk about later. World Rugby follows a different association than International Rugby League. Now that we've got confused, let's carry on. At the time in 2020, the updated regulations were among the most exclusionary policies for trans athletes instituted by an international federation to date. And they were a departure from the IOC's guidelines even from before. The reason why I bring that up is not about rugby, but about the reaction to that and the responsibility that organizations have when they see a harmful policy from a governing body, even if that is above them. It is still important to say, hey, that's not how it works. Or if you want it to work like that, it doesn't work here because it can't work here, type of thing. For World Rugby, one of its subsidiaries is Rugby Canada, and Rugby Canada provided feedback to this proposed guideline at the time. And to quote, Rugby Canada has made clear that the draft guidelines as currently presented are not policy that can or will be adopted should they move forward. Rugby participation in Canada will continue to be guided by the existing trans inclusion policy and the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. To sum it up in a nutshell, World Rugby was asserting policies that are outside of what we would consider to be in line with our ethics in Canada. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to talk about Canada a little bit here, but US Rugby put out a very similar statement too. One of my links actually is going to have a link inside it that will go to the US Rugby statement as well. So there's just your quick US plug. To quote from Rugby Canada's CEO, Alan Vanson, our trans inclusion policy was written and developed by Sport, Law and Strategy Group and is aligned with the guidance document creating inclusive environments for trans participants in Canadian sport. On a note, I love the vast majority of that document on so many ways. I only say vast majority because I get nitpicky about some little things. This is a document that I personally have provided to organizations who have wanted to improve their inclusion policies. I find it to be a fantastic resource and highly recommend it for any organizations who are looking for guidelines and or mandate principles to create a more inclusive space for two-spirit, transgender, non-binary, and other gender-diverse individuals too. Participation in community rugby in Canada is encouraged based on the gender in which a participant identifies and is not to be subjected to requirements for disclosure of personal information beyond those required of cisgender athletes. And that is one of the most important parts right there, and I'm going to tangent on this specific line, which is why I'm bringing it up. Is not to be subjected to requirements for disclosure of personal information beyond those required of cisgender athletes. When I came out, why did I feel I had a responsibility to share with sports leagues that I'm participating in that I'm trans? That is a rhetorical question. The challenge is it should never even have to be a question. Under no circumstances is it supposed to be validated for a trans individual to have to disclose themselves in ways that are expected outside of what cis individuals have to do for themselves. Yes, I'm a trans woman. Here's all of my documents to prove how trans I am. Here's all my documents to prove it, and here's my medical history, and here's how long I've been transitioning. Here's my timeline when it comes to these forms of surgeries. Here's what my expectations are. Here's how I currently live socially. Here's my current identification. Here's my preferred information. It's just in the mail. Why does a trans individual have to go through all of those forms of disclosure as an expectation, but cis individuals don't have to do the same thing? Why did I have to tell organizations that I played sports in that I'm trans? Why did I have to go through all of the measures to share with peers, teammates, and so on? I could register and participate, and that would be the end of the story if I was a cisgender individual. But because I am not a cisgender individual, I need to prove myself to belong, because cisgender individuals like to police the bodies of others. To quote Tim Powers, who at the time of this printing was the board chair of Rugby Canada, as a national union of a G7 nation, we recognize our leadership role in this area. Rugby Canada believes that all individuals deserve respectful and inclusive environments for participation that value the individual's gender identity and gender expression. We want to ensure that all participants have access to programming and facilities in which they feel comfortable and safe, and will continue to take all steps necessary to do so. Even though the parent in World Rugby said blah 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 trans exclusion, Rugby Canada said no, trans inclusion. We have a responsibility to be inclusive. You can't tell us to be hateful to other people. More organizations have a responsibility to do that. The CCES, Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport, has a document that is shared frequently and used frequently by many organizations, creating inclusive environments for trans participants in Canadian sport. And so Rugby Canada, their trans inclusion policy, models most of it. You could see the framework pretty easily if you're comparing policies in different organizations, and I can tell you with confidence that this was not necessarily a full copy-paste, but absolutely following these guidelines as well recommended as possible. Some of the elements of eligibility guidelines in here. Based on this background and available evidence, the expert working group felt that trans athletes should be able to participate in the gender with which they identify, regardless of whether or not they have undergone hormone therapy. Exceptions could be made if a sport organization is able to provide evidence that demonstrates that hormone therapy is a reasonable and bona fide requirement, i.e., a necessary response to a legitimate need, to create a fair playing field at the high performance level. Necessary and need. Need is not the same thing as preference. Canadian Women in Sport also issued a statement and a letter regarding World Rugby's policy. The ban violates the human rights of transgender and gender diverse women, forcing them out of sport and denying them the benefits it brings. The discriminatory ban perpetuates the harmful and marginalizing practice of gender policing in women's sport. Has anyone noticed a theme yet? This isn't about fairness. This isn't about safety. This is about policing. And for every individual that advocates and encourages the exclusion of trans individuals are also allowing their bodies to get policed by people who want to control your body. Moreover, the ban places greater value on the fear of harm, which for the record, the solution is not a need, but a preference to cis athletes, which is seen to outweigh the certainty of harm to trans individuals caused by the ban. And the solution to certainty is a need, not a preference. World Rugby League got nefarious 2 years ago, and 2 days after FINA announced their trans exclusion policy. Yes, trans exclusion policy. I'm not calling it an inclusion policy when it's not. International Rugby League chose to essentially echo the same sentiments as World Rugby League. To sum it up in a nutshell, I'd like to announce an expectation. Canada Rugby League Association, because Rugby Canada is Rugby Union, Canada Rugby League Association is Rugby League. Remember, they're not the same. The CRLA inclusion policy is for all intents and purposes the same as Rugby Canada. So I would expect that an organization that is following those same principles are going to issue a statement against International Rugby League. I'd also like to point out that International Rugby League's statement already have in one sentence 2 ways of framing how to address trans women that are not really following best practices nowadays as well. So they're creating statements and issuing policies without really having an understanding about trans individuals. It kind of shows right here where there are individuals who think they know best, but more often than not, they don't know anything. The article that I'm going to link as well, just to show about International Rugby League, being equally nefarious as World Rugby. Also shows that about 2 weeks ago, International Cycling Union ruled, pun intended, their trans inclusion policy backwards. They still have an inclusion policy, but it is even more restrictive than it was before. I'll talk about that in a little bit, and the reason, as a matter of fact, about why cycling is important when it's related to Canada. The International Rugby League explained its reasoning for a decision, and I want to go on record that any organization that does something that is against human rights, having to make a statement to defend why they violated human rights, also acknowledges that they're violating human rights, but are trying to find enough people to support them about that violation. Right? If you go ahead and you do something harmful, and then you're expected to validate the reason why you're harmful, you're also saying, I acknowledge I was harmful and I'm sorry that you, for example, don't enjoy this. They make a statement about their decision, and they cited the guidance from the IOC in 2021. Remember, the IOC's advice shifted from the focus of individual testosterone levels, not about, what age individuals experience puberty and so on. None of that. The guidelines, the guidance, the framework was about addressing the individual and calling for evidence to prove when a performance advantage existed, not to speculate and endorse fear-mongered concepts. The framework said no athlete shall be excluded from competing based on unverified, alleged, or perceived unfair competitive advantage due to their sex variance, physical appearance, and or being trans. International Rugby League can't describe trans women accurately, and apparently can't read accurately. I touched on this really briefly about International Cycling Union. It was really difficult to find an article that actually had more to it, and that's actually going to get emphasized in something I'm going to say soon. And that said, I'm also not going to be providing a link to Cycling Canada's website because my antivirus was freaking out. I have never seen a website that apparently would be from a reputable source lose its mind so much. So I'm not going to put a link and then put other people's systems at risk. So that said, Canada Cycling, check your site. Not cool. If it amounts to anything, cycling as a whole is such an incredibly corrupt sport. It was the last thing that I was surprised about. Honestly, it kind of fit the bill. So nonetheless, I've got an article here that has a nice write-up about trans inclusion when it comes to International Cycling Union and so on. But a very powerful closing thought in this was, while conversation around how to best ensure fairness and inclusivity in women's sport is vitally important, it's equally critical to remember that every athlete in question is a human being. Certainly, all discussions should begin with empathy and a desire for understanding, along with full transparency to the public. A real need for inclusion should be in an open process, not a few paragraphs tucked away in a lengthy, multi-topic press release. One of the reasons why I wanted to use Cycling Canada's website is I'd like to go straight to the source, but there's an article that I can use to reference about why Cycling Canada is relevant in this sense. So in 2015, the IOC made new rules that at first glance expanded trans athletes' rights. Since 2003, the IOC had allowed trans athletes to participate in the Olympics, but only if they have undergone complete gender reassignment, including genital surgery. They're expecting trans individuals to modify their bodies in ways that they might not want to participate in sport. I've said before in my own videos, I'm not interested in any of the big stuff. Not interested. I've got a consult for an Orchie next week, as a matter of fact, literally 1 week as of the time of this recording. That's just a technical thing. I'm 41, I'm not having kids, but I'm not putting myself through any other type of surgery when I don't feel there's a need or a desire for it. The IOC at the time was saying that, well, to be a woman, you must go ahead and carve your body to how we choose to define what a woman looks like. Sounds really weird when you say it like that, right? So a Canadian cyclist named Kristen Worley sued the IOC, claiming the rules were a human rights violation. The IOC revisited its policy, came out with significantly newer guidelines, which became guidelines that inadvertently defined the playing field for women, intersex, and trans athletes for years to come. And the 2015 rule offered a more welcoming stance to trans women and trans feminine athletes. Trans women who've been on hormone replacement therapy for at least 12 months would be allowed to compete in the Olympics against other women, and that was based in part to a published study that showed HRT did not make trans women more competitive in women's divisions than they had been in men's. The policy also meant that requirements for genital surgery were gone, and that essentially mimicked many ways that the NCAA policy, which I'm going to bring up later, had been in place since 2011 for their championship events. The NCAA policy, to sum it up in a nutshell, was as long as you're on HRT, come as you are, and play in the division that respects your gender identity. In comparison to that, let's say U Sport, which is, I don't want to say equivalent, but let's just say in terms of where the levels of performance go, in terms of what national bodies and whatnot would be too. So let's say that U Sport would be a similar equivalent in Canada to NCAA in the US. But U Sport says that as a trans individual, you are eligible to participate in whatever division for the sport that you're participating in that is in alignment with your gender identity, regardless if you're on HRT or not. It is based on your gender identity and also in congruence with your gender expression, so long as that you are also staying within the anti-doping policies. So the NCAA was, at the time, stepping towards progressive. However, Canada's policy when it comes to U Sport was fully inclusive. And is, for that matter. I should make sure to say it was in 2018 that U Sport's policy came out, but they've stood with it since. So I want to start approaching the deal when it comes to FINA and everything about why this is important to me. First, thank you to everybody who has been following along so far, because I do understand this is longer, but this is important stuff. If I just made a 5-minute I condemn this, it's not going to educate, it's not going to help. People know that I already condemn it just by knowing me. Even though I'm not the biggest name in the world, hardly even the biggest name in my neighborhood. For anyone who knows my name knows that if it's anti-trans, and especially anti-trans in sports, I condemn it. And I want to explain as to why it's worth condemning and why it is important for you to condemn it too. And it is important for you to share it with other individuals so they can learn and also condemn it as well. I don't feel I need to explain Lia Thomas. There are a couple articles I'm going to touch on in a few places. Beautiful write-ups, of all things considered, beautiful write-ups about the story when it comes to Lia Thomas, when it comes to the NCAA, when it comes to US swimming, and so on. I'm not going to read the entire article. Please create the time to read it. Well written, very insightful, very thoughtful, and very angering in many places. And I believe strongly that you'll enjoy it very much. And a couple of the things that stood out to me in this write-up was, again, it goes through the story, so without needing to get too deep into it, when controversy started to happen when it comes to Lia Thomas, there would be letters that were written to Penn, to NCAA, and so on, but they're also unsigned. They're anonymous, unsigned letters. What does that say, right? Hey, I'm transphobic, but I don't want to get caught for being transphobic. Why can't you own your hate? I'm hateful, but I don't want to be seen as hateful. That's kind of a weird take, don't you think? What's the risk? What's the loss? What happens if you happen to be hateful upon someone else? To the parents, to the swimmers who criticized Lia, to everyone who was trying to write to get their way but wouldn't sign their name. What could go wrong? Having your name published publicly in an article because you're transphobic? What do you lose? Do you lose a relationship? Are you with a partner who's actually a progressive individual, an inclusive individual, and saying, I don't want to be with someone who's full of hate? Do you lose your family? Would your husband or your wife or your partner look at you and be like, I never realized you were this type of person. I don't want to affiliate with someone who's not inclusive. Do you lose your job because your workplace has a mandate for inclusion, but they don't want to find out that you grit your teeth to get a paycheck and you don't actually provide inclusion at the workplace, but you provide tolerance and perhaps masqueraded as acceptance, but never inclusion? Why would those names not show up on a letter unless they were afraid for being identified as being hateful? And why would you have a fear of being seen as hateful if not for the fact that you recognize that your hate was wrong? Aside from the letters, individuals would speak to Sports Illustrated, to share their piece on this, but on the condition of anonymity. Because heaven forbid their transphobia and their name attached to their transphobia and their hate and their discrimination and their exclusion gets published. Heaven forbid that there's accountability for being hateful. Nonetheless, this is a beautiful article. I strongly recommend everybody to please check it out. And there's another article. Honestly, I feel like it would be responsible for me to read the entire thing because the entire article is so powerful, So to borrow a couple paragraphs from this article, trans people in sports are generally ignored until they begin to win. That's when they become threats to the status quo. How many people have experienced playing sports with a trans individual and have no idea? Ask yourself that. How many times have you participated in sports alongside a trans individual and have never even known, or have known but they never would have been a concern for anyone else because they did not likely affect the outcome of the game, but you were happy that they got to participate in sports in conjunction with their gender identity because that gives them a space of belonging, it gives them an appreciation of their sense of self, it gives them some camaraderie and friendship. Heaven forbid that someone just happens to be good. Not like I know anyone like that personally. A restrictive policy like this dehumanizes transgender athletes, reducing them to their bodies and their biology. It erases their humanity, putting the perceived fairness of a sporting competition, and it must be asked, fair for whom? And we're going to visit that right away. Above the rights of an entire class of people, putting the perceived fairness of a sporting competition above the rights of an entire class of people. It deems only those who can perform their transness in a certain way worthy of being allowed to compete in a sporting arena. But there's more than that too. These kinds of policies filter transness through a cisgender lens, warping it into something that cis-sexist society can understand. It is prescriptive of how people should be trans. Not every trans person is transitioning from one seemingly binary gender to the other. There are many ways to be trans, as there are people in the world, and not everyone wants hormones or surgery as part of their transition. These policies also associate transness with medical intervention, invalidating the trans identities of trans individuals who cannot or choose not to seek medical transition. And perhaps most damaging of all, a framework that requires trans people to have begun medical transition before puberty seeks to set up a hierarchy in which people who have an awareness of and access to transition in childhood are deemed more acceptable or less threatening, and therefore better. I'm going to touch on that later. That is 100% correct. Establishing on the requirements because of the fear of cisgender individuals, so long as they can body police trans youth to become what their ideal form of trans person would be, then everything's okay. Instead of developing a societal system and an organic evolution so that trans youth and trans teens and trans young adults, trans seniors can choose to transition when it is best for themselves. And what that means is, in an ecosystem like that, trans youth who transition earlier and earlier and earlier in life, should there be a medical opportunity for them to do that, then grow into a life that is as close as possible to a cisgender individual. Why do cisgender people get to make policies that police the bodies of transgender people? The trans community is consistently gatekept from accessing gender-affirming care that cis people are allowed. Hormone blockers or hormone therapy like testosterone and estrogen, progesterone, spironolactone, and finasteride are regularly prescribed to cis people. Not to mention hair removal procedures, hair transplants, variety of plastic surgeries, breast augmentation, face lip fillers, vaginoplasties, liposuction, muscular implants, and more that are provided to cisgender people for reasons that include increased self-confidence and allowing them to feel more comfortable in their bodies. Why is that normalized for cis individuals but such a hurdle or an obstacle to become accessible for trans individuals? Just to create some concepts for people to perhaps relate with. Hormone blockers, depending on the medication, can be used to address prostate cancer. Many of the hormone therapies that I mentioned are used to address menopause. It's not all about trans individuals. The medications are the same. They're used at different times in life or for different people for different needs. So why is it so difficult and inaccessible for trans individuals to get the health care they have a right to at the same degree as cis individuals? If not for cis individuals fixating on policing the bodies of trans people, and furthering that, men policing the bodies of women. There is no such thing as half support. Either you support Leah Thomas, myself, Taylor LaChrist, as a woman, or you don't. There is no you're a woman except when. I talk about intersectionality quite frequently, and this is a great time to remind everybody that the conversations when it comes to trans individuals and the controversy and the consistent efforts to erase trans individuals comes from the same place as it does for every other marginalization. I'm going to put a video right here, and I talked about things like left-handedness, and I also talked about things involving racism. Left-handedness makes a lot more sense when you watch that video, but when it comes to racism, we all can understand racism. We have it fundamentally understood to not be racist. And we know that if we see racism and don't denounce it, we are affiliated with that racism. Those are things that's beaten into all of our heads, and the only people who don't agree with that are the racists. But that said, that racism, it comes from the same place when it comes to transracial and so on. It's colonialism, white nationalism, accelerationism, fascism. You can include religion to the pile, but that's all just married with everything else like I was just mentioning. Name it. But the dialogue is identical. The efforts that are made are identical. And especially with recent history, and especially considering what month it is, let us be mindful about everything that we've been discovering in recent history regarding the residential schools, the horrid events that happened. Those behaviors, those practices, those exclusion principles, the concept of a church trying to remove the being of a child from themselves. What makes that any different than what is happening right now when it comes to trans youth, trans athletes, and so on? So every time we discuss these things about a trans athlete, take that word trans out, put it over to the side, and replace it with the word indigenous, black, disabled. That sentence still means identical things, but have fun saying that thing with integrity. But it is so normalized to criticize trans individuals. It is so normalized to accept the idea that trans people are opinions. I dare you to say to an indigenous person, I completely support everything about you. I completely support your desire to be an indigenous person, but you're not an indigenous person with us here. I dare you to say that. I dare you to say, yeah, of course. You know, I love you to pieces. Of course you're black. I'm so happy that you find comfort in being black, but you can't be black when you're playing ball because I might get hurt. I dare you to say those things. And that is why this is such a crisis about policing, because there's normalization of addressing things that are more understood. Racism obviously is still rampant, but it is beaten in our heads, at least in any place that's got just a modicum of progression to it. More consciousness about more accessibility for people with disabilities. But we continue to allow a conversation about the validity and the reality and the acceptance of a trans person. The reason why trans people become controversial is because society doesn't allow us to be our authentic selves as early in our lives as possible. And then when we choose to finally accept the challenge of being authentic in society, we don't meet society's expectations because the cis world stopped us from having a gift of growing up with the bodies that we have a right to. Cis people can create change if they reframe their language, they reframe their mind, they reframe their understanding. There is no half support. There's no you're trans except when. There's no you're indigenous except when. There's no you're black except when. There's no you're disabled except when. There's no you're cis except when. There's no half support. And if you still, but you are exclusionary, you are discriminatory, you are bigoted, and you are a problem. Considering how recent it was, I would love to address Title IX and the values of Title IX to help resonate with American listeners right now. But the US is essentially doing the best it can to hold my beer to Nazi Germany at a rate that is higher than I ever imagined I would experience in a lifetime. So let's stop talking about the laws. But let's talk about the logic about the laws. From HRC, more than 290 anti-2S LGBTQIA+ bills were introduced across 33 states in 2021, including more than 140 specifically anti-transgender bills. Each of these marks set a new record for anti-equality legislation being introduced and enacted in a single state legislative session since the Human Rights Campaign began tracking legislation. 2021 is recognized as the worst year on record for anti-2S LGBTQIA+ legislation. 25 of those bills were enacted, 13 of which targeted transgender youth despite legislators failing to provide examples of what exactly they were legislating against, i.e., making legislations for things they didn't understand or did not exist. 2022 has seen even more bills introduced. I want to make sure that it's understood that this article that I'm pulling this from was written in March of 2022. So remember the number that I said for 2021? At the time of this writing, HRC was tracking over 583 pieces of potentially 2S LGBTQIA+ related legislation introduced in the 2022 state legislative session. 313 of them, at least, of those bills are harmful, and 137 of them, at least, are anti-trans bills. In March, the bills aren't popular and are not driven by constituent demand. This unprecedented wave of discriminatory legislation is not organic. These bills are part of a coordinated effort driven by well-funded, powerful interests and promoted by a tight network of anti-2S LGBTQIA+ forces, including the Heritage Foundation, SPLC Designated Hate Group, Alliance Defending Freedom, and Focus on the Family, who often write and lobby for passage of carbon copy bills in as many states as possible. These groups peddle in fear and pit people against each other to marginalize and punish 2S LGBTQIA+ people, and especially transgender children. This is not and has never been an organic thing. This has never been just Joe Public and Jill Lunchbox thinking that, you know what, I'm starting to think a little weird about trans people. No, these are people being influenced by hate groups. And every single person who accepts any of those ideologies of discrimination have fallen prey to the values of hate groups. This wave of dangerous proposals exacts a heartbreaking toll on 2S LGBTQIA+ people, obviously especially trans youth. These bills highlight discrimination, marginalization, and pain that 2S LGBTQIA+ people, especially young people, especially trans youth, and especially their families, continue to face. Too often, it's trans young people who are caught in the crosshairs of anti-2S LGBTQIA+ equality legislators' divisive political strategies. Why? Because these hate groups have successfully infiltrated the very fragile minds of people who lack critical thinking. And for politicians to keep and secure their riding, they must speak to the constituents who will vote to them the most. When you have individuals who have no idea except how to hate trans people because that's the only thing that they know about trans people, because other people who are fascist, who are white accelerationists, who are white Christian nationalists, and so on, have influenced these rather influential and impressionable people to be their vehicles of hate. 2020 set a record number for anti-transgender bills filed with 79 bills. 2021 surpassed that record with 147 such bills, and now 2022 is on track to break that record again. For trans youth who are simply trying to navigate their adolescence to bear the weight of these attacks year after year, these bills take a toll. I'm going to put a link to a video right here. This is my Trans Awareness Week video. I spoke about not just Trans Awareness Week, but the year prior to when I published that video. And in there, I discussed more about bills, policies, and everything that I was just talking about before. Another longer video, nothing unlike this one. Please create the time to watch it. It's Trans Awareness Week, but the reality is every day is Trans Awareness Day. So long as we continue to allow these bills to exist, so long as we continue to allow hateful people to influence ignorant people, and so long as we continue to allow hateful voices to have influence in places that promote inclusion and belonging. For 2S LGBTQIA plus young people. Anti-2S LGBTQIA plus laws indicate that they are unworthy of respect, decency, and visibility. So now that we've got an understanding about how these policies go uncontested, typically, FINA's policy promotes itself as an inclusion policy, but fails in arguably one of the most exclusive and restrictive ways possible. I'm going to link the policy just like I do with as many other articles as I can about this. FINA's policy, to sum it up in a nutshell, to simplify things, is young trans women, if they experience any testosterone-dominant puberty after the age of 12, are deemed ineligible to compete in high-level sports, and being FINA, high-level aquatics. How many ways can we possibly count the problem of an arbitrary number that is not a static type of onset of puberty in an ecosystem that is not always the most accessible to identify these onsets of puberty, and in a system that is supportive to encourage a young trans individual to identify and become at peace and want to accept and embrace their sense of self and be in a community that helps give them a sense of belonging. Shall we count the ways? Let's do it, because I know I did. There was an article written by Lindsay Gibbs on power plays that was written well before this FINA thing, but there are a couple quotes in here that echo a lot of the stuff that I'm going to say, but I'd like to just use this as a citation as well. The focus on the onset of puberty is incredibly dangerous. First, there's no uniform age or date in which puberty begins, nor are the signs of the exact start of puberty uniform across the board. So how exactly would this be monitored? Everyone gonna run to the doctor every other weekend just to see if puberty started yet? It would be reasonable to expect this to be a devastatingly invasive process that would be disproportionately discriminatory against racialized individuals who are typically perceived as being more adult than their same-aged white counterparts. It's also a very classist policy too. So a trans girl decides that they want to begin to medically transition. Is she just going to stop by the front office to go into the medical office there during lunch break and, get everything taken care of right then and there? Anyone can do that? Hardly anybody even thinks about that. That type of healthcare, it's not cheap, not uniformly accessible, regardless of age, regardless of location, and so on. It's a policy designed by people who want the perfect world, thinking the perfect world exists for people they want to be part of a world they define as perfect. Okay, so let me break this down now. So like I said, under what circumstances and in what universe is it even acceptable and normalized to first test a child every other weekend or whatever to figure out if they've experienced the onset of puberty in the first place? So that alone is already just a major error. There's also a reference about Tanner stage 2 when it comes to puberty, but that's overcomplicating everything because fundamentally it's an exclusionary and borderline impossible policy, and allow me to explain why. Before it's even considered if a child will ever be an elite level athlete, this pre-pubescent youth knows in their heart, soul, and their sense of self, it's not aligned with the life that they're either presenting or are expected to uphold. They must have the confidence and courage to tell their family that something is not aligned. They must have the confidence and the courage to share with their family that they want to embrace their sense of self. There's one step. You have to have a child acknowledge their sense of self. And I'm not saying that's not possible, but I'm saying that you're expecting the first step of all the things to be the child to overcome all of the fears and the promotion from the society the child lives in that they're wrong, to say, no, I'm right. That said, the legal and social climate for 2S LGBTQIA plus people has a direct impact on how 2S LGBTQIA plus people form families, become parents, come out. Historically, in the face of anti-2S LGBTQIA plus legal and social climates, 2S LGBTQIA plus people have tended to come out later in life. Today, it is getting a little earlier and earlier, but still on a scale, it's still later. It's just earlier later. Does that make sense? When it comes to kids coming out, regardless if they're trans or anything else in the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, it's not uncommon for 2S LGBTQIA plus youth to come out to their families last. About 86% of those who identify as 2S LGBTQI plus individuals reported that they came out to a close friend, while only 56% have told their mothers and 39% have told their fathers. Coming out to family members can be daunting for young adults and teens, and obviously by extension that's going to involve, kids under 12, but by telling a friend before parents, that child can be testing the waters of how someone might react. You can make new friends, as difficult as it is. You can make new friends who are more supportive of yourself if you're a 2S LGBTQI plus individual, who are more supportive of 2S LGBTQI plus identities, but it is more at stake if a parent does not react positively or supportive to the news. 46% of homeless 2S LGBTQI plus youth ran away because of family rejection of their sexual orientation or gender identity. 43% were forced out by parents. 32% faced physical, emotional, or sexual abuse at home. 45% of 2S LGBTQI plus youth seriously considered attempting suicide in the past year. And the data is from 2021. Nearly 1 in 5 trans and non-binary youth attempted suicide, and 2S LGBTQIA plus youth of color reported higher rates than their white peers. So of that 45% of all the 2S LGBTQIA plus individuals, now when you take away the trans individuals from that group, of that fraction, 20% of them tried to commit suicide. Fewer than 1 in 3 transgender and non-binary youth found their home to be gender affirming. Being the Trevor Project, it is a world scope of an organization, but it is most frequently recognized as, American data, American studies. And so with that, I also have some Canadian information, and a study done in Canada that was published last month shows that about 62% of youth reported strong parental support. And I want to underline it, when a study says strong, that also means there's other variables. So depending on where you live, there's about 30 to 60% probability, I guess is a good way to put it, of a home being affirming to a young trans child. So we have to play let's pretend and create this theory, this probability. If a young trans athlete wants to be an elite level swimmer, these are all the things that she needs to do. We'll just do the things. You have to have the child recognize and identify their sense of self before the age of 12. And they have to share that with their family. Many trans individuals don't really start to recognize the incongruence with their gender identity versus their body until the onset of puberty. Once, things start growing that weren't growing before, once things started getting hairier that weren't hairier before, once things start sounding more different than they used to before, and then all of a sudden those things that are now becoming very pronounced and evident that are starting to become unaligned with your sense of self, according to FINA, well, too late. You should have known earlier. You should have known the things you never would have known because your body didn't give you any indicator that it would have been an issue for you. But hey, you know what? I guess you're not swimming anymore. Go try cycling. Oh, wait, yeah. Go try rugby or something. Oh, yeah. Whoops. So nonetheless, let's pretend we've got a young trans youth who knows their sense of self at an early age. I can say people like that exist. I am one of them. I did not have the courage to speak up or do anything about it, but I've known from my earliest memories that the boxes that I was getting put into did not align with my sense of self. But now, this child opens up to a family, 30 to 60% chance of being accepted. So let's just say 50%, just to use as an even number, 50% chance. Somehow they manage to luck out and the 50% chance is in their favor. The child recognizes their sense of self. They find the courage to share their sense of self. Their family accepts them and embraces them. Let's find a compatible health service provider to support this child. The biggest barrier, both to safe hormonal therapy and to appropriate general medical care for transgender patients, is the lack of access to care. Despite both guidelines and data supporting the current transgender medicine treatment paradigm, transgender patients report that lack of providers with expertise in transgender medicine represents the single largest component inhibiting access. Transgender treatment is not taught in conventional medical curricula, and too few physicians have the requisite knowledge and comfort level. Not even considering right now everything that is happening in the US, where bills continue to get introduced and passed, depending on the state, that is essentially trying to make it illegal for doctors to provide health care to trans youth. So let's just pretend dreamy world, but let's just pretend that doesn't exist just for a moment. Let's pretend that the US does not hate trans youth. So of all of those things that I just mentioned, legal or not, the odds of finding a competent and welcoming healthcare provider, it's not a common thing. Many physicians don't know that they can prescribe, whether it's hormones or puberty blockers or whatever is applicable and appropriate at the time, and they don't feel like they've got the knowledge or the skills to provide care for trans folks and especially trans kids. So the World Professional Association for Transgender Health just recently lowered the minimum recommended age for hormone treatment to the age of 14. According to FINA, they want people who are not experiencing any sort of testosterone-dominant puberty after the age of 12. So what do? First, do you have access to a competent healthcare provider? And then, will that healthcare provider correctly diagnose gender dysphoria for that trans youth? The age of 14, remember I mentioned hormone treatment? Hormone treatment would be something like prescribing estradiol, testosterone, or what have you, but that doesn't stop that healthcare provider from at least providing puberty blockers. Puberty's physical changes can cause intense distress for many gender non-conforming individuals. When taken regularly, GnRH, save the science analogs, suppress the body's release of sex hormones, including testosterone and estrogen, during puberty. The benefits of using puberty blockers would primarily address gender dysphoria, the misalignment of sense of self and the body, and how society is creating expectations on that individual. Gender dysphoria is a feeling of discomfort or distress that might accompany a difference between experienced or expressed gender and sex assigned at birth. And which type of sex is that, do we remember? Phenotypic, right? Presentation. Gender dysphoria that starts in childhood and worsens with the start of puberty rarely goes away. As in, if you know your sense of self before puberty and you're also conscious enough that you know that once you start to hit puberty, your body is going to go in a direction that is not in alignment with you and your sense of self. And I know someone. So for children who have gender dysphoria, suppressing puberty might improve mental well-being, reduce depression and anxiety, improve social interactions and integration with other kids, eliminate the need for future surgeries, reduce thoughts or actions related to self-harm. Now remember, puberty blockers, puberty suppression might not ease gender dysphoria because there are other elements, as I mentioned, social and family and so on. However, by at least getting the body to stop following its original predisposition and allow this trans individual to just establish her sense of self and to just be at peace and get a better understanding of where they are in life and understand better who they are as individuals so they can make a more educated decision about how to approach their future without having their body force them in a direction that might not be aligned with their sense of self. That will help a trans individual so much in knowing how to navigate life in a much more healthy way going forward. Having a medical professional correctly diagnose a young trans child with gender dysphoria and have the competence to know that while they might not prescribe them with hormone replacement therapy, which is not unreasonable, but to at least prescribe them with puberty blockers so that, as I was mentioning, that child can just establish who they are, best understand who they are, so they can make more educated decisions going forward that also prevents a testosterone-dominant puberty from happening. So then we're playing Let's Pretend still. We've got a child who recognizes their sense of self. We've got a child who recognizes their sense of self and they have shared with confidence their sense of self to their family. And then their family supports them enough to the point where they have found, somehow, a competent medical professional within their jurisdiction. What else can go wrong? I'm glad you asked. Other reported barriers include financial barriers, lack of insurance, lack of income, discrimination, lack of cultural competence by healthcare providers, health systems barriers, i.e. inappropriate electronic records, forms, lab references, clinic facilities, socioeconomic barriers such as transportation, housing, and mental health. While some of these healthcare barriers are faced by other minority groups, right? I remember I was saying about intersectionality. Many are unique and many are significantly magnified for trans individuals. Could anything else possibly go wrong? Absolutely. I'm super happy that you asked the most important question. Let's pretend we've got a child who is going through all of these fantastic things with perfect success. What are the odds? What about the community? After all of these things about having a child identify their sense of self, have a family that supports that, have a medical system that is able to provide them the care that they need, and then to have systems around them in terms of just the fundamentals, in terms of the finances, the kids, just in good mental health and all those other good things. So everything's just peachy and dreamy. What if that community does not accept that child? What if the school does not accept that child? What if their friends in their neighborhood does not accept that child? What if sports organizations and sports agencies that are interesting to that child to participate in do not accept that child? What do all of those other values that I just mentioned matter to any trans youth who has somehow these embedded hopes and dreams to become an elite level athlete? What does all of that other effort matter during this entire process if the community does not accept or provide a sense of inclusion or a place of belonging for that trans youth or their family? If the systems do not embrace the authenticity of that child, how do they even have a fighting chance to participate in one of FINA's most prestigious events? Alabama is a great example of a state where it is impossible for a trans child to become an elite level swimmer because Alabama does not allow healthcare professionals to prescribe puberty blockers for trans children until after the age of 19. Pretty sure puberty's kicked in by then. And so another video I'm going to put right here is my call to action for Trans Day of Visibility. It's a call to action for sports organizations about their responsibility and their expectation to create a more inclusive space for trans athletes, and especially when it comes to making it clear their inclusion when it's all said and done. That policy from FINA is not an uphill climb for trans youth and trans women to participate in aquatics, in elite level sport. It is a statistical near impossibility, and that's intentional by FINA to do that. FINA has mandated trans erasure. FINA is essentially saying, we don't want you, and we're going to force you out in what looks like the kindest and most innocent way possible. Stop using girls and women's sports as a vehicle to discriminate. As I've said time and time again, this is not about fairness. This is not about equity. This is about policing, and this is about erasure. Bills that get passed often cite words like fairness as a reason to exclude trans women from women's sports. Is it really all that fair when an individual is being eliminated from having a fulfilling life? Perhaps we should discuss what the word fairness is, but before we get to that point, let's just remember this closing line here. In the fight for fairness in women's sports, don't get distracted from the real threats: access, pay, investment, representation, sexual abuse, doping, and others. To confront those issues, it is vital to make sure that all athletes marginalized by gender, and not just cisgender women, and not just cisgender white women, are at the table, i.e., trans women are women. Stop letting men police women by getting women to fight with women. Coincidentally enough, what is the definition of fairness? Well, we could say a pale color of skin or hair, but that seems just a little on the nose, don't we think? Oddly coincidental. The other definition for fairness is the quality of treating people equally or in a way that is reasonable. So is excluding an individual or defining them by circumstance on your convenience reasonable? I don't think so. And I certainly wouldn't consider that to be equal treatment with anyone else. But let's expand on that just a little bit. Fairness can be looked at in three different ways. There's sameness, there's deservedness, and there's need. Now that word need actually comes and has some sort of relevance here. So sameness is the fairness where everything is equal. Equal pay, equal rights, equal representation, equal da-da-da, equal blah blah blah. Deservedness. I worked hard, therefore I deserve reward. The fairness that is the one that probably should be heard the most, but utilized the least. Need. Those who have more to give should give a greater percentage of what they have to help others who are unable to contribute much, if anything at all, i.e. share your privilege, promote equity, and so on. Fairness here takes into account the facts that humans have obligations to one another, and the more one has, the more is demanded of that person to contribute to the common good. Fairness and responsibility are linked. Compassion plays a role in the calculation of fairness. This is fairness as social justice. The first one is about the fairness as a quality of outcome, and the second was a fairness as individual freedom. The third one is about being socially responsible. The definition of fairness in sport acknowledges the need to be responsible and equitable to your peers. So let's just roll back to that conversation I brought up about the genital exams in Ohio. If those are done in the interest of fairness to all women, does that sound really fair? Would any woman in her right mind advocate for another woman to have her body exposed to validate the satisfaction of someone else? Is that fair? I don't think that's fair, but what do I know? I'm a trans woman. Do I know what fairness is? 2S LGBTQIA plus kids have legitimate threats and obstacles to overcome, especially so if they are trans. 86% of 2S LGBTQIA plus youth reported that they've been targets of bullying, harassment, or assault at school. Studies have shown that bullying and harassment of 2S LGBTQIA plus youth contribute to high rates of absenteeism, dropouts, adverse health consequences, and academic underachievement. If you've got 2S LGBTQIA plus youth, trans youth, being bullied in school, and so on, do you think they're really that excited to go participate in sports as well, where they would be likely participating in the same ecosystem with those individuals who are bullying them? Not likely. When left unchecked, this type of bullying leads to such dangerous situations for young people, and lawmakers should not be bullying trans kids. Borrowing a stat from GLAAD, and I'm doing this to respect the largely American demographic that watches my videos. The Trans Awareness Week video that I linked earlier, right at the very beginning, has Canada-specific statistics that are going to be very similar to what I'm going to talk about here. The trans community experiences unemployment at twice the rate of the general population, with rates of trans people of color up to 4 times the national unemployment rate. Trans people are also 4 times more likely to live in poverty. 90% of trans people report experience harassment, mistreatment, or discrimination on the job. The American Medical Association has stated that trans people face an epidemic of violence. And remember earlier how I was talking about bills going record year, record year, record year? That has been the same when it comes to worldwide deaths, when it comes to hate crimes against trans individuals, when it comes to violent crimes against trans individuals, and so on. It is going higher every year. Trans people face barriers in accessing healthcare, as mentioned earlier, including anti-trans bias and laws allowing providers to deny care to trans patients, especially children. All of these realities result in trans people, especially trans women and trans people of color, experiencing extremely high levels of minority stress that results in poor mental and physical health. According to the U.S. Trans Survey, 40% of trans respondents reported attempting suicide compared to the 4.6% of the population as a whole. 4.6 is not a good number at all. To make that clear, 4.6% of an entire population has contemplated suicide during a period of time during a survey, but when you extrapolate trans individuals from that exact same data set, 40% of those individuals have contemplated suicide. And obviously that goes the same when it comes to Canada. Even trans Canadians are more likely to have experienced violence since the age of 15 and more likely to experience inappropriate behaviors in public, online, at work than cisgender Canadians. And again, as I mentioned, the Trans Awareness Week video, the opening of it has links and the data is curated towards Canada more so. And I referenced many articles and materials that can be used to discuss very similar numbers, very similar results of very similar surveys for Canadian individuals and Canadian trans individuals as to what I was just mentioning a few moments ago. This is a great time to reflect on a quote that was made by Anne Lieberman, who's the Director of Policy and Programs for Athlete Ally. While everyone is hyper-focused on hypotheticals in elite levels of competitions, trans kids are dying. So let's bring it home about FINA, and this is where it's going to feel a little more personal now. First, thank you for making it through this journey, and I know this is likely going to be one of my longest videos ever. This part is where it's going to get a little more personal because now it's my backyard. FINA makes a policy that is an impossible policy for young trans youth to truly achieve, to become an elite level athlete. FINA has mandated exclusion of trans women from their elite level sports in a very long-winded, no we didn't do that actually sort of way. And this continues to get frustrating because with rugby following immediately after, cycling being just before, this is showing this isn't coincidental timing. This is going to be a wave of federations who are going to promote and enforce and mandate anti-trans policies and fundamentally trans erasure from sports. So while FINA ended up creating this exclusion policy, and I want to point out that I acknowledge that they've proposed this theory of an open category, othering trans individuals, othering non-binary individuals, othering people who you don't find compassion or interest in having an inclusive space for, does not count as being inclusive. Othering people is not inclusive. Othering people is being exclusionary. Othering people is not creating a safe and welcoming space. Putting an open category off to the side when you don't really even know what an open category looks like is a way of saying we can't completely eliminate you, then people would find out that we're trying to remove you from the sport. But if we try to make it seem really nice that we want you to play and this is the best place to put you, then everybody wins, right? So while FINA fails terribly at everything that they do, I find out that Canada's representation for FINA, Aquatics Canada, or AFC, Aquatic Federation of Canada, voted in favor of FINA's policy. So while everyone out there is yelling about FINA failing, FINA failing, FINA failing, FINA's failing, I haven't found details on the other two governing bodies, but to note that Canada's representation for FINA voted in favor of this trans exclusion policy is a slap in the face as a Canadian, is a slap in the face as a trans woman athlete, is a slap in the face of an advocate trying to help create a safer and more inclusive space for Canadians. It's a slap in the face in every single way, and it's a slap in the face because the paperwork says, don't support this. There are three tiers, I guess is kind of a way to look at it, three different ways to look at how Sport Canada encompasses sports. With one, there'd be the national sports organizations, and so those are the governing bodies of the sports independently. Rugby Canada, as I mentioned earlier, Cycling Canada, and I'll get into more details about everybody who's underneath AFC. Then you've got other organizations that are considered national multi-sport service organizations. I mentioned things like CCES before, Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. There's other things like Safe Sport and so on. And those are all agencies that provide services based on what the needs are that can be applicable to all of the sports in the NSOs. The dialogue can be translated from any of these organizations and plunked into every single governing body. And then there's the Canadian Sports Centres and Institutions. Nonetheless, AFC is Canada's member federation to FINA, the International Federation which oversees aquatics, and also ASUA. The subsidiaries of AFC are Diving Canada, Canada Artistic Swimming, Swimming Canada, and Water Polo Canada. AFC voted in favor of these trans exclusion policies. I am not calling them trans inclusion policies because they are not inclusive. You can't make them. Remember how I mentioned an organization like Rugby Canada had a trans inclusion policy? An inclusion policy that also acknowledged trans athletes. Cycling Canada, CRLA, had something similar. Their policies emulated CCES guidelines. And remember, CCES is one of the national multi-sport service organizations under the same umbrella for Sport Canada. So you'd imagine that they're all talking to each other of, hey, can I have your notes so I can make a policy? Yeah, absolutely. And things happen. Water Polo Canada has the same thing. An inclusion policy that, for all intents and purposes, copy, paste, change sport name, off we go. The other three do not. They have policies that imply the value of equity, of diversity, and inclusion. But they do not have anything addressing trans inclusion and addressing their support of Canada's fundamental goal. None of them actually have anything close to what appears to be a similar framework. Instead of being a federation working together, they seem to be rather independent and not conscious of the organization as a whole. Swimming Canada's policy says equity is the belief and the practice of treating persons in ways that are fair, equitable, and just. Swimming Canada is an inclusive organization and welcomes full participation of all individuals in our programs and activities irrespective of race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, age, marital status, family status, or disability. So you would imagine Swimming Canada's values would reflect within AFC. Diving Canada expands on those with definitions. Equity, fairness afforded to individuals with diverse personal characteristics regardless of those characteristics. Is that definition of the word fair again? Diversity, the presence and integration of a variety of individuals with different personal characteristics, particularly underrepresented groups in a group or organization. Inclusion, acceptance of individuals with diverse personal characteristics into a group or organization regardless of those characteristics. Underrepresented groups include women, children in low-income families, Indigenous people, seniors, people with disabilities, newcomers to Canada, and members of the 2S LGBTQIA+ community. So you would imagine with that equity, diversity, and inclusion policy, and also being a subsidiary of AFC, that AFC would also continue to lean towards voting against FINA's anti-trans policy. Artistic swimming includes the principles of EDI. Canadian artistic swimming recognizes that discrimination, prejudice, or harassment based on personal attributes including race, ancestry, place of origin, color, ethnic origin, citizenship, creed, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, age, marital status, family status, or disability is contrary to human rights principles and will not be tolerated. CAS is fully committed to implementing inclusive rules, policies, and practices that ensure all people are able to participate in a safe, open, and welcoming environment in our sport. Equity is demonstrated by treating people fairly. This is promoted by removing barriers and by the creation of accessible and respectful environments, including any reasonable accommodations required to allow equal opportunities, equal access, and equal benefits to participate so that people can achieve their personal potential in the sport of artistic swimming. Valuing diversity means respect and appreciation of differences in individuals and in groups, and honoring and upholding human rights. It also means valuing various points of view and being open to new and different ideas. And inclusion ensures that everyone feels welcome, comfortable, and that they belong. So if Artistic Swimming Canada shares those principles, and if Diving Canada shared similar principles with less words, and if Swimming Canada shared those principles with even less words, but also followed Water Polo Canada's principles that showed those same values, why did AFC vote for trans exclusion? Everyone wants to talk about FINA. I want to talk about AFC. None of it is a surprise. Not even 2 months ago, Sport Canada pulled a survey on inclusion. They yanked it. They discontinued it because of more than enough complaints about discrimination on that survey towards transgender athletes. Athlete Ally, an organization advocating for equal opportunity in sport regardless of sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression, said in a release that the Canadian High Performance Athletes 1 survey uses language that discriminates against transgender athletes. Athlete Ally says that language in there demeans and devalues trans women's identities and humanity and ignores scientific research demonstrating that the athletic capabilities of transgender women are not comparable to those of cisgender men. Thank you, again, Sport Canada, for continuing to amplify the transphobic messaging that you, as an organization, are trying to bury behind fancy words that don't have any enforcement or any accountability to agencies like AFC for completely dismissing the values that they have an obligation to uphold. Thank you for all of that. So how does this get corrected? It starts by mandating change. I'm going to point to a video right here that I'm pretty sure I said the line in at some point or another, but it was very much related to sports and Sport Manitoba. In this case, nice people don't need to be told how to be nice. So by mandating change, what that's doing is it's not trying to be an authoritarian figure. It's essentially saying to the bigots, to the TERFs, to the racists, to the transphobes, to the intolerant and the intolerable, they are welcome as human beings. They're just as welcome as everyone else to participate in the sport, but their hate is not. Their hate is not welcome. There are rules, policies, and accountability that say you, as an athlete, are able to participate. Your exclusionary beliefs, your exclusionary practices, your will for violence upon others, whether it's passive or active, is not welcome. We mandate that instead of hoping for the best, looking in the direction of where these organizations are headed and heading. Look what's happening in the United States. I like to point at it frequently enough, but are we to expect an organic growth, an organic understanding, not by the public, but by decision makers, by lawmakers? Are we to expect these individuals who are responsible to be responsible, to stay responsible? We can't. What that does is it puts vulnerable individuals at risk should there not be efforts of mandating inclusion. Here is how it works, not here is how we would like it to be. If you give an inkling of space for a person who is hateful to share a doubt or a reason to hate, you are not doing your job. Your responsibility as a sports agency is to mandate the removal of hate. And how do you enforce those mandates? Pretty easily. And I'm really happy to see a precedent begin. You withhold funding. You freeze funding. If that governing body sees an organization not match its minimum requirements, you withhold or freeze the funding until compliance is met. I'm going to put a video right here, another Sport Manitoba one, but about Sport Manitoba's failures, about mandating all the wrong things. Sport Manitoba is offering the opportunity for funding to organizations who do not practice DEI. That makes no sense. Just recently, Canada's sports minister froze Hockey Canada's government funding in the wake of a situation involving an alleged sexual assault. Hockey Canada, Canada's untouchable. The sports minister said, you're not getting any money until you behave. And if Hockey Canada can be subject to getting itself back on track of addressing sexual abuse, violence, harm, why can't any other organization also follow suit? Why can't any organization have their funding withheld or suspended or revoked if they do not follow equitable and ethical practices? That is how you mandate change. By telling people, I know you want your money, you can have your money, you have to do the right thing. You don't get your allowance until you do the dishes. And you're not getting your allowance next week if you forget to do your dishes again. It's as simple as that. But why don't we do that? Because people are too afraid to deal with the backlash. But there's also no reason for the backlash. Two more links that I'm going to share in the description are declarations. One was a London Declaration of 2001. The other was the Red Deer Declaration of 2019. Both of those declarations were addressing systemic failures in sports. And they were signed off on approved, encouraged by the federal, provincial, and territorial ministers of sport for the respective areas. The London Declaration, with a whole bunch of signatures right on the bottom of it. Expectations for Fairness in Sport, 2001, London, Ontario. Those who participate in sport will receive from their fellow athletes, coaches, and officials, and parent guardians and spectators fairness and ethical treatment in a safe and welcoming sport environment free of harassment and abuse. Their sport system will help to advance the widest array of athletic goals of all participants, with or without disability, without discrimination, and in spite of barriers based on personal circumstances. In spite of barriers based on personal circumstances. Does that not sound like addressing the personal circumstances of a trans individual who perhaps didn't have access to trans healthcare earlier in life when they had the right to, because of all the reasons we mentioned earlier, all the hiccups that could happen after an individual identifies their sense of self, after they end up finding, if not a family that supports them, but a network that supports them, finding a healthcare provider who understands them and is competent enough to provide them the healthcare service that they need. The systemic issues all around for all of them to hopefully be aligned so that healthcare is affordable, the community is welcoming, and everywhere in between. Does that not all sound like perhaps personal circumstances that would be barriers to individuals, but nonetheless, when an individual manages to achieve their most authentic sense of self, their best self, that they are supported by all of the organizations, all of the ministers, all of the everythings? Does that not sound like in 2001 in London, it was agreed upon that trans individuals had a place of belonging in sports? In 2019, the Red Deer Declaration, sport must be free from harassment, abuse, unethical behavior, and discrimination regardless of sex, gender identity or expression, ethnicity, religion, language, age, sexual orientation, ability, or other basis. Federal, provincial, and territorial governments have a critical role to play in ensuring and sustaining a safe, warming, inclusive, and respectful environment that is free from harassment, abuse, and discrimination. And so on. Same messages, repeated. So why? Please tell me why. Why are all these yeah buts acceptable? Why do people look at that and go, yeah, no, that's cool, that makes so much sense, but trans athletes still aren't valid? Explain the yeah buts, aside from ignorant people who embrace hate. So how do you fix that? As I mentioned, nice people don't need to be told how to be nice. Bad people need to be told and stopped from being bad. And you do that by mandates. You do that by policies. You do that by enforcement. You do that by accountability. You do not do that by education. You do not do that by hope. And you do not do that by thoughts and prayers and gambling on the lives of vulnerable athletes so that you don't have to deal with crying from the privileged ones. Athletes and organizations have a responsibility to promote and support every athlete who has a right to play as their best and most authentic selves. They have a responsibility to stand beside the most vulnerable athletes and uplift them. They have a responsibility to use their platform and their privilege to hold the owners of unethical failures to account and assert correction for change. Athletes at all levels have a responsibility to educate themselves about their bigotry and not at the expense of individuals who have not and will never share the same life experience as them. Governing bodies have a responsibility to remove the hate and occasionally the hateful, but never the hated. There will never be inclusion without understanding, and you will never understand when there is no belonging. Families, communities, schools, workplaces, and government agencies have a responsibility to create and uphold a space of belonging for all people from all vulnerable communities. And when it comes to trans kids, we must recognize the expectations put on them to overcome the fear perpetuated on them by a system that endorses their erasure. The sooner a trans individual feels they are safe and belong in their community, the sooner they may begin to embrace their sense of self. When enough trans individuals no longer live in fear of our cis-normative world, And our systems and agencies, whether it's in sports or not, encourage and endorse trans individuals to embrace their sense of self. Over time, it then becomes earlier and earlier and earlier in the lives of trans people to live with their greatest authenticity, which then also means they will live their lives as similar as possible as a cis individual, which then also fundamentally eliminates every bigoted argument about advantages at the same time. To recap, the sooner a trans individual embraces their sense of self, the sooner they may have a life that represents that of a cis individual. Not every trans individual will or is obligated to medically or physically transition, and that is where it is still imperative for sports agencies, sports organizations, and athletes to embrace athletes for who they are. The arguments about fairness, the arguments about advantages, the arguments about the thises and the thatses, reduce, minimize, and quite possibly eliminate when the cis community starts accepting the trans community, not police the trans community. Sports agencies, sports governing bodies, and every transphobic athlete can solve their own concern within one Olympic cycle, within 4 years, if they all stopped finding artificial glory in 1,000th of a second. Sports has been and will continue to be a cornerstone of culture and society, and will equally continue to be one of the largest machines of change. If sports mandates inclusion, society mandates inclusion. And when society mandates inclusion, we can finally, easily let trans kids play. On that note, this is going to get wrapped up. Thank you for taking the time with me today or over multiple days, depending on how you went through this. If you enjoyed this content, please hit like. If you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe and share, please. This is going to go to something that I'm going to ask for you to do in a moment, but let's just talk about hitting the share button. Get this to your socials, get this to your networks, get this to your friends, get this to organizations and agencies who you feel is important to have this heard. So please like, please share, please subscribe. When it comes to this as a whole, you might ask yourself during this time, how can I help? The easiest thing to do for starters, as I just mentioned, please share. And honestly, again, please like. That's a little algorithm thing, and it does help. It does make a difference. It does make change. Please like, please share. Get a hold of your local sports organizations. Get a hold of the local governing bodies. Get a hold of media. Get a hold of people who can talk about this and ask them, how do we address these things? How do we stop allowing exclusion with veiled inclusion right in front of it? So reach out to these organizations and ask, how are they creating an inclusive space? How are they enforcing an inclusive space? Ask the question. Get it known that it must get known. Get it known that it's important. Get it known that these policies cannot be lip service, because these policies, if they're not held up to account, harm people because of false expectation and a false sense of belonging. Please make sure to take a look at the links in the description. There's a campaign for new mode, and what that is as well is a call to action to elected officials in your area to incentivize change for their businesses, organizations, and communities to optimize their CSR so that they can encourage a safe and welcoming community for the vulnerable individuals who live in the vicinity of those businesses, organizations, and communities. I think this is a great time to wrap everything up. Otherwise, I feel like I forgot something, but if we take a look to see how long this is, I'm pretty sure that's forgivable at this point. Thank you again so much for taking the time with me today. I hope you truly do enjoy this. Please let me know what your thoughts are. If you have any questions, please make sure to include them. Please make sure to share this as much as possible. Please help create change. Please help save trans lives. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your night. Have a great rest of your week, as I always enjoy saying.